So Times of India came in and said that we can provide you that medium that you require to reach out to your consumers in India. By 2015, we had made over 800 investments. And in doing so, I think all put together, we had invested over $3.5 billion by that time. The model was very successful in India. What we also realized is that there's another pain point that we can address, which was essentially of companies looking to expand from international markets into India.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the segment where we feature what we think are some of the best media investors globally. And I'm super excited and honored to be here with Piyush. He's the Executive Vice President of the Times Group. He also oversees Brand Capital International and all new business initiatives for the Times Group. So Piyush, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Kyle, and I'm really excited to be here.
We looked at well over 60 companies that I think are pretty impactful media investors globally. And one of the venture funds that stood out to us was Brand Capital. And not only your guys' approach to both the media industry and consumer products, the startup ecosystem, the way in which you support a lot of the companies, you have a fantastic portfolio, your business development, especially getting companies to expand into India is really impressive. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you. Maybe let's just start off with who is the Times Group, who is Brand Capital?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the story of the venture capital arm will also really come through if I first talk about the media conglomerate, that's the Times Group. So the Times Group is a large media company based out of India, headquartered in India. It's a 180-year-old organization. It started as a print company in 1838. And it's still a privately held company. Print still remains to be its largest category in terms of publication. But along with print, the company has also diversified its assets across multimedia properties. So we are currently the largest in print, but we also have a very dominant presence in India in digital, in television, in radio, in outdoor, in magazines, and a host of other media properties. And what Times has been able to do consistently is create a brand over many years, which essentially resonates really well with the audience in India. So, like I said, other than print, which remains to be our cash cow still, we also happen to be quite large in something like digital, which we started early on in India in 1995. And we soon ventured into television, we soon ventured into events. In India, every year we do around 1,500 events. And so the scope of each of these media properties in itself is quite large. Come 2003, we decided that we also want to diversify as a company. And we started looking at what are the ways in which we can utilize our media properties, this very 360-degree presence that we have, and which really sets us apart from other media companies, both in India as well as internationally. And the model that we came up with is something called Brand Capital, which essentially allows us to invest in companies who already have a good product, have a good service, have a good team built around it, but want to reach out to their consumers. So Times of India, through its division called Brand Capital, came in and said that we can provide you that medium that you require to reach out to your consumers in India. And in that, we started making a few investments in 2003. By 2015, we had made over 800 investments across different sectors and for different categories and different life cycles of companies as well. And in doing so, I think all put together, we had invested over $3.5 billion by that time. The model was very successful in India. We were investors in companies like Flipkart, which was acquired by Walmart. We've invested in a number of other large companies in India like Big Basket, Snapdeal. It's a very long list. But what we realized is in the course of working on Brand Capital as model for Indian companies, what we also realized is that there's another pain point that we can address, which was essentially of companies looking to expand from international markets into India. And we had seen some of the other major international players try to do this on their own, but they were finding it particularly hard. And this is for several reasons. India is very different from the Western markets. India also can sometimes be a complex landscape for companies to maneuver through on their own. It's a labyrinth often for new players. And therefore, we decided that as a company who's been in India for the last 175 odd years, who understands this landscape quite well, why not we come in and become strategic partners for these companies who are looking to expand into India? And which is when Brand Capital International started. We started our first office in 2015 in Silicon Valley. And we started looking at companies who wanted to expand from North America into the Indian market. And in that, we started making some investments. At first, the Times Group made some investments in later stage companies like Uber, Airbnb, Coursera. And then soon after, we also shifted our focus to early and growth stage companies. And over the course of the last 6 years now, we've made around 30 odd investments between our mature stage and our growth stage investments. The model essentially remains the same in that we help these companies connect to the consumers in India through our investment. But at the same time, we try and set up a springboard for these companies to enter the Indian market. So the model is very bespoke based upon what it is that each individual company is looking to do in India. And based upon what their preferences, what their objectives for the Indian markets are, we get together, huddle together, and decide on what the strategy should be, and then help launch these companies in India. That's in brief about the Times Group and Brand Capital International.
No, it's absolutely incredible seeing that as a kind of a media conglomerate that's almost dominated every single component of media, whether you talked about radio to traditional print to video content and television shows. It's incredible not only what you've built, because as media is very difficult to have, but at the same time leverage that as a resource and kind of utilize it as a way to connect with some great companies, make some great investments, but actually use it as a tool to help them grow. And I think it's a fantastic model as a media company and a conglomerate. But I wanted to...
And just to add an additional point to that, even the media landscape in India is particularly different from what it is in the West. And the West, where print has fallen off the cliff, in India, traditional media still dominates the media landscape. So while television is the largest, print is the second largest, and digital, while growing at a double-digit growth rate every year, still lags behind both television and print. So therefore, for companies who are looking to expand into the Indian market, the understanding of consumer in itself is a question that needs to be answered. The whole marketing piece also requires a re-understanding of how the landscape really works. And you have to start spending money on something that you long ago forgotten about, stuff like print, which still really commands a large mind share of the Indian consumer.
Interesting. No, it's impressive. You guys are already built up a massive conglomerate and understanding. Pretty sure the majority of the consumers that exist in India, and you understand them very well. And I think that's such an incredible strategy and tool and resource to give to a lot of your portfolio companies. Now, I wanted to highlight this and get your thoughts about how you actually break down what are the companies that you want to spend time with and invest in, because it is a pretty broad mandate. You have a massive portfolio. You said well over 800 companies that you've worked with in the past. But how do you filter down what type of companies you want to work with? Do you tend to fall into more consumer focused products, and does that also overlap with media as well?
So if you talk about our portfolio in India, I would say it is a very diverse portfolio in that we are across all categories. It is definitely more consumer focused. I would say it'll be a 65-70% in favor of consumer versus B2B. So that's the India portfolio. When we specifically look at companies who are looking to expand from the international markets into India, in that our investment thesis dictates that we look at companies who've already established their business model in their existing market. So let's say if the primary home market is US, we would ideally want to see the business model having been tested, there being some amount of traction with the revenue model that they currently have in place. And also the fact that the cost of expansion into a new market like India should be incremental, should not be very significant. So for us, these two things primarily matter a lot. That's what our first two check marks are as far as investment thesis is concerned. Then, of course, we go through the usual route of our due diligence. We look at the founding team, always a very important factor in these matters. And we also, of course, try and understand the product in itself. Does it have a strong value proposition for a market like India? But yes, you're right in saying that it's consumer oriented. Again, in the US also, 70 to 75% of our portfolio is more consumer focused and should have established itself in the market that it's currently in, so that we know that it's a working model and can be replicated in a market like India. And to your question about whether or not we focus on media, it is definitely a sector we're very interested in. We've in fact made some investments in the media space over the last decade or so. When we first started our office in the US, we acquired the largest broadcaster of cricket content in the US called Willow TV, and which added to our overall pool of media offerings that we have in the US. We have recently also acquired the OTT platform which essentially now allows us to be the second largest OTT platform in India. And that is a space that we are always very interested in because the synergies, that we can bring in through our existing media business. And we keep our eyes open for investments in that space at all times.
Interesting. This is always something that I'm just curious getting from more of a corporate venture arm is, and you guys have made some pretty impressive media investments. And even the the newer 35 portfolio that's international. It's like a combination of music and dating and social networks and content and a variety of other like vertical content focus. Do you guys ever look into products that may be disruptive to your own business units, or is this kind of a depends on the situation?
That's a good question. And to be honest, there isn't a clear, black and white as to when we look at an investment, whether this falls under the bucket of applying this to our media properties and our in-house, the infrastructure that we already have, versus investing in this company purely from a financial standpoint. I think the intent is to essentially go out there and find opportunities. If along the way we happen to find something that has a particularly good synergy with our existing media business, then we get very interested in that and we try and see if we can bring it within the portfolio of Times Group. But if not, we are always very interested in a way, outsourcing the R&D to some of these startups who are doing a fantastic job in reinventing how media really works and having just riding it along with them. So we take both of these approaches essentially.
Interesting. No, it definitely makes sense. Now, being a media conglomerate that's been around for over 100 years, obviously you guys have lived through several iterations about how media constantly evolves, and you've continued to stay on top with that. And kudos to you guys, because I think that's very hard. But I'm just curious, you mentioned a little bit earlier about some dominant forms of media and content in India specifically. How do you think media or content is evolving in India? And what do you see that's might be in the near term future about either the way in which content is distributed or created?
I think, first of all, time and again, people have made the prophecy that traditional media is going to die sooner or later. And that has happened in some markets, it has come true in some markets, but in India, it really hasn't, I feel. Traditional media still dominates that space. Television still remains the largest, print, not a very distant second largest media property in terms of ad spends. And it's for the simple reason that the habit of the user, with properties like print, it sticks, it stays. So people like picking up a newspaper in the morning and reading that newspaper to get their daily dose of news. Even though they've read that or they've seen that in the previous day on the television channel or on a digital platform, they still want to read a newspaper. And I can ascribe this to the trust that people have over time built with brands like Times in India. And at least I would like to believe that Times has a large role to play in keeping these traditional media properties alive. I think over time, what we have witnessed is that English, which is an aspirational language in India, definitely is a great medium for newspapers. But now we are seeing an increased interest in even local language newspapers. So we have expanded our own reach in terms of what we offer in print to not just English, but we now have a Hindi language newspaper. We have a Bengali language newspaper, and we've added several more. And print still happens to grow at a significant rate in India. It's not something that's degrowing. In fact, it still has a growth that happens every year in that space. So definitely print is around and it will stay. Television, I think, like everywhere else in the world, is a medium that a lot of advertisers pay attention to and will continue paying attention to. I see both us in terms of the investments we are making in that space, as well as the larger market not shying away from television in the near future. Digital has been a force to reckon with everywhere in the world. And same is the case in India. It is, I think, currently it's experiencing a growth rate of around 36% year on year in the Indian market. And thanks to a fantastic infrastructure that has been brought about by some government policies as well as some private players, and at the same time, a very young population, more than 60% of India's population is still under 35 years of age. These two factors put together, there's definitely an increased propensity to move to digital mediums. And therefore, digital again is the space for Times Group specifically, where we've made a lot of investments in the last decade or so. And we can see digital definitely taking over, some pie away from the more traditional forms of media. But it's still a very interesting market in that you'd still have a platform like radio, a platform like out of home, not being non-existent. It still commands a good share of an advertiser's wallet.
No, it definitely makes sense. And obviously, your guys' ability to understand each and every one of those verticals and build a pretty large presence is really impressive, I think, as a media company. I'm actually curious, going back on the model that you talked about at the very beginning of the conversation, you have a unique investment approach because you are providing a lot of your media services in exchange for equity, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Does this change your investment approach or the type of companies you're sourcing? I know you talked about a little bit earlier, a little bit more established companies, but I'm just curious if this has any effect on your investment thesis as a kind of a corporate venturing arm.
So as far as brand capital is concerned, whose primary model is investing media assets in return for equity, brand capital would play a large role in any company's marketing and communications effort. And therefore, for us, we want to invest in a company that really wants to get out there, either in front of consumers or in front of businesses. We see ourselves as an outsourced CMO to the company in India. So I would say, as far as marketing and communication is concerned, we play a very large role right from the first day. We have a team within Brand Capital, which is called Brand Strategy. It's their responsibility to essentially handhold the company throughout their effort into the Indian market, how to communicate with the audience in India, what it is, that is palatable and what is not. So that means that our investment thesis also requires us to find companies wherein that can be an important and large play. And therefore, again, going back to the point that 74% of our companies happen to be consumer facing, because that's essentially where a large media company like us can play a big role. Not to say that we haven't made good and successful investments in B2B companies as well. We definitely have. Some of our investments like OddUp or Endorse are very B2B in nature. And these companies have utilized both our print as well as our digital assets to reach out to their consumers. But our investment thesis, again, it keeps redirecting us in the direction of a consumer, or if not in the direction of a consumer, in the direction of a consumer eventually, where the consumer is the end user, even if it's B2B2C sort of a business.
Absolutely makes sense. And I think as an investor, I think one of the most powerful aspects of your guys' fund is, and any venture investor, is if your ability to drive sales back to your portfolio companies, and if that you can do that in a big way, I think that's probably one of the most valuable things that you can get from your venture investors.
Absolutely. And just to add to what you said, it also allows us and allows a company to take away that expense from their P&L and put it in their balance sheet, right? So it is no different than a company raising capital from another more traditional venture capital firm and then utilizing that capital towards their marketing efforts. We are instead coming in and saying, while we do this, while we provide you this marketing effort, this marketing capital, at the same time, it comes with a whole level of understanding, intelligence, and strategy around that marketing effort. So for us, we don't see ourselves as a static investor in that we want to make sure we go above and beyond just providing that capital. For us, it's also a matter of making successful investments, developing case studies over time. And therefore, we only make 3 or 4, or at max 5, 6 investments every year. And our approach is a very hands-on, working closely with the company kind of an approach when they're looking to expand into the Indian market.
No, makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. I want to shift gears away from the investment thesis and now dive in on some of your portfolio. You have a vast portfolio, especially whether it's India and now looking internationally. Is there any international deals that you recently have invested in or companies that you're working with that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, there's several, and this might be a long list, so probably I'll highlight a few and you can stop me when you think I've been going on for too long. I think there are a few companies that we're particularly excited about, not to say we're excited about the others, but the ones I can mention within the span of time that we have. Square Panda is one such company that is a Sunnyvale-based company. It started its operations in India with our help in 2020, and we've seen a rapid expansion in the company's India business. So the company first started in Sunnyvale here in the Valley. And it's an Andre Agassi Foundation-backed company led by a fantastic founder. His name is Andy Butler. And his vision was always to essentially bring early childhood education to India. And in that, he's been able to very successfully use the network of Times Group to reach out to the government in India to essentially bring that value to elementary education that is now being provided in India. So what they've been able to do is they've been able to strike deals with the government, and they've gone the B2G route in India, and which they're now making use of the Right to Education Act that was brought about in 2009, under which elementary education has been made compulsory for all children under the age of 14 years. And in India, this specific section was very underserved, I would say, until recently. Only 50% of the children were really getting that elementary education up until 2012, I think. There is definitely a lot of focus that the government has on this in this space. And Square Panda is making use of that impetus that the government is bringing in, as well as the excellent product that Square Panda has to offer, these two things put together to impart education through their platform in India. So that is one we are particularly excited about. India now happens to be their second largest market after United States. And there's an ongoing campaign right now that Square Panda is doing in India. And it's giving us some really good results. So that's one we're particularly excited about. There's another company called Endorse. It's a company which is based out of Singapore. And to talk a little bit about, just to take a step back and talk a little bit about our reach. So essentially, we started in North America, like I said, in 2015. But soon after, we realized that there are companies across the world who are looking to expand into the Indian market. So after our Silicon Valley office, we then opened an office in New York. And then soon after, we opened another office in Canada. And now we're looking to expand into other cities in America, like Austin, but also more international markets like Singapore, Australia. We're looking at United Kingdom now. And this is because we've been able to find investments in these places, even without a presence there. So we've made an investment in Singapore, we've made a couple of investments in Europe, we've made an investment in Australia very recently in a listed company there. And therefore, we see that this appetite for expansion into the Indian market is not just restricted to companies in the United States. It's really a global phenomenon at this point. And we want to be everywhere so that we can handhold these companies into their expansion. So Endorse happens to be one such company that we found in Singapore. And Endorse essentially helps bring down the cost of hiring a resource by introducing hackathons in that process. So they primarily focus on IT as a sector right now. And what they do is instead of a manager having to go through 500 resumes and then shortlist 10 and then interview each one of them, Endorse makes that process super simple by introducing hackathons in between and saying, we'll let you test the candidates out, and that'll essentially tell you who's good and who's not for what you're looking for. And Endorse, again, is somebody we started working with in 2018. They have made a lot of use of our print assets in India. They are a more B2B company. So, one of those, I think, of the 30% that we have in our B2B portfolio, it's a company that is really made of use of our print assets because of the brand halo that Times of India brings to Endorse. When Endorse wants to talk to some of the larger IT firms in India, like a TCS or a Cognizant. So it makes it easy for them. It removes that friction for them to reach out to these people and say, why don't you use Endorse's services for your hiring needs? That's another company we are particularly excited about. They've seen significant growth in the last couple of years. So yeah, those are two examples, B2C and B2B. I'm happy to go on.
It's fantastic. No, it's always a fun question to ask because it's if we had the time, we would just go through the entire portfolio. But no, I think those are great examples of two things. One, showing the diversity of different companies that you work with, both from geographic regions, but also the types of products that they're building, either B2B or B2C, or in this case, B2G. But then at the same time, showing that regardless of the type of tool, how you've been able to help these companies, one, navigate a market like India, but actually really build out a presence there. And I think that's hard to do. And if any company, whether it's B2B or B2C, I think you guys are the absolute right partners to be working with in this scenario. I'm curious though, still on the portfolio side, having looked at your portfolio a little bit, do you guys tend to gravitate towards more platform solutions, whether it's in this platform like media, it's not necessarily the content, but how the way that they distribute or a software solution, or do you guys like to focus more on brands?
I think it is a mix of two. However, it goes back to the investment thesis that I was referring to, in that the companies that we really look at are the companies that require incremental capex to expand into India. And it's not a very significant amount of capital expenditure to do that. And that really works well with platform companies because they've already, again, like I said, tested their product probably with the platform that they have in their existing market. It's a matter of taking that, readjusting it for the Indian market and applying it for India. In that, the amount of money that you have to spend is not very significant. And the amount of resources that go into it are not as significant as you would have for something that's more capital intensive. And we try and do that is because we don't want to distract these companies from their home market. We don't want them to lose track of what's most important, which definitely still is India. Oh, sorry, which is still their home market. But India should be something that slowly becomes a very important market for them, but it's not going to happen overnight. India is a market that we tell everybody you have to be patient. It takes a little while. So you won't see results in 1 or 2 years. You need to have a long term horizon, 4 to 5 years. So our investment thesis also stipulates that most of the companies that we invest in, the way we invest in these companies is that we divide our investment in two tranches. A first tranche, which is a smaller amount of investment, which allows the company to expand and launch into India, but then a second, much larger tranche that helps support their next 3 to 4 years effort in the Indian market. Because we understand that 1 or 2 years support from us is not going to be enough. So, in most of our investments are generally committed for a 4 to 5 year period. And that's what we tell the companies also, that have patience. There's going to be a lot of speed breakers, but at the same time, when you finally get there, you'll get to the treasure chest, essentially.
It definitely makes sense, and especially for a lot of companies trying to expand in a region and being able to leverage a media resource like yourself, knowing that you're both, it's a win-win scenario for both of you to find success in that, especially given the relationship that you built with the companies in your portfolio, I think is a really great approach. I want to shift gears away from the portfolio and actually focus in on just general media market questions. As a media conglomerate, and someone who looks at the combination of consumer and a mix of media products, I'd love to get your thoughts on a few things. But media generally at the moment in current, present day climate, and I don't know if this changes depending on the geography, but there's a lot of, I would say, turbulence. I don't know what better way to describe it. I won't name specific examples, but it seems to gravitate typically towards more news, politics, and social networks, et cetera. And it brings up a lot of questions about what might be right or wrong, or means in which content's created, or what's right way to distribute content, how that's controlled. I know I'm being very vague here, but I don't want to bring in specifics, but how do you think this changes the way media companies operate, create, distribute content, or even in the software realm for platforms or companies that are more B2C focused? Is this turbulence going to change the landscape of how content or consumer products are created, distributed, or do you have any thoughts generally about this turbulence of media or what's going on in media generally?
I would say to a certain extent, we are already past that stage of turbulence, and we've already seen a sea change that has come about in the media landscape. The way media was consumed up until 10 years ago, and now with the advent of platforms like Medium, for example, it's disintermediated a lot of players from the market. And in that, media is becoming more and more democratic, in my opinion. It's becoming more accessible to everybody, both from a standpoint of contribution as well as a standpoint of consumption. The turbulence that you're referring to, I would agree that it definitely seems like it's in a constant state of flux. But I feel that's just the nature of the new world that we're all experiencing, the digital world that we are all a part of. And I think it's going to be a little while before we are able to go past this entire state of turbulence. At the same time, I feel this is where maybe some of the more traditional media properties play a very important role, in that the level of trust that you would generally got to a media property that's more traditional versus what's digital, I feel is different. So, for example, we carried this campaign in India a few months ago where there was this whole conversation around fake news, which has been the talk of the town everywhere. And we spoke about how in print, the fact that you've printed something, you can't go back and make edits and change it. So you have to be doubly or triply responsible for what you're printing there. Because once it goes out from the printing press, once it's in the hand of the consumers, you've written it there. Unlike a digital article, which we can go back and edit. So what we feel is that it really, over time, the whole emphasis on trust around a brand will help filter the goods from the bad players in the industry. And essentially, it'll all come down to a trust and a brand name when it comes to media. And I think it is media, even though to us right now feels like it's in a state of flux, I feel if we go back 30 years ago, and if we were to ask the same question to somebody at that time, they also probably would say that this seems like everything's changing from what it was 30 years ago. So I think that's just the nature of human psychology as well as the specific business that we are in. But I see us all making some significant progress in the right direction. And like I said, I think media is becoming more democratic in nature, which to me is a good sign.
Interesting. No, this isn't your first rodeo. You've been around for 180 years. And I'm pretty sure the conversation always pops up every decade or so. But it's always interesting to get your thoughts as a media company, but also an investor in this space. Do you think there's any big changes or new ways in which we're going to consume or distribute content in the near future, and maybe in India specifically, or just generally or broadly speaking?
Yeah, again, I think there have been many changes that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. There are these platforms that essentially deliver content in short form, either through video or in text. I think that has really taken off in the recent past, and something that people prefer just because of the paucity of time and because there being so many platforms that people have a tendency to switch between platforms. So they really don't want to spend a lot of time on a single platform, and that these short form, whether it's video or whether it's text content platforms, have done quite well. And I think that I can see being an industry trend going forward. I think that is something that all media companies, including ourselves, we have focused on in the recent past. I think an offshoot of that, video content particularly, I think has become definitely one of the more mainstream aspects of media. And I'm talking about video content that's delivered more digitally than video content on television. And as we've all seen with the rise of platforms like TikTok and other platforms in the space, I think there is generally a tendency to move towards video because the ease of consumption that it brings about compared to something that's more text based. Yeah, I think those are two very noticeable changes, trends that at least I can see in the market, and I don't see it changing. If anything, will probably accelerate in that direction in the near future.
Do you think that the business model of digital content is evolving, moving away from advertising, our traditional form of advertising, or do you think it'll shake out to generally be the same that it always has traditionally been?
I would say it is some advertising still happens to be our bread and butter, and we are witnessing a change in how consumers want to consume that media and whether or not that advertisement brings about a change in their behavior. We are seeing that, and people are recognizing that there's generally a movement towards subscription and removing advertisements. At the same time, I would say the fuel that will really run media in the near future, in my opinion, would still be the advertising dollars that it brings to large platforms, let's say like Google. And I say that because this is a change that will only come about slowly in a consumer's behavior. In India, for example, it took the consumer a significant amount of time to move away from the idea of paying a total of, I think, somewhere in the vicinity of $3 to $4 a year for a newspaper subscription to paying $10 a month for a subscription of a platform like Netflix. Right now, the consumer in India, for example, is used to receiving that news for almost no cost at all. It was mostly supported through the advertising dollars that were brought in by the newspaper. But now there's definitely a shift towards a greater willingness to pay for subscription related models and some of the other more innovative models that have come about. But again, I see this changing more slowly than some people have predicted. That's my opinion.
It makes sense. It feels like there's this constant flux, but at the end of the day, it's still based on the consumers and generally what they like. And it's hard, I think, to get a lot of individuals that are used to a specific type of model to just all of a sudden jump to a whole bit different business model where pricing doesn't necessarily match with expectations.
Exactly.
But it's interesting to get your thoughts on that. I'm curious, obviously, this past year or so, we've gone through a giant pandemic, and that's been detrimental in a lot of different ways to a lot of startups and companies and industries. I'm curious, has the pandemic affected you or your company or the way in which you look at startups that you make investments into?
Like I said, I think we'd all be remiss if we'd not to talk about what the pandemic has done to how we all operate. And there's definitely been an impact that's been felt everywhere in the world, including in India. And I think as a company, we of course felt the same impact at the beginning, but because of the fact that this is an organization that's been built over a course of 180 years, and it's withstood many such past incidents, I think we we were able to face it pretty well, and in fact, we came out quite strong out of this whole crisis. As far as our investment business is concerned, what we've realized is that because there is a lack of investment dollars that were available in the market, and because the founders had a greater ability to focus on markets that it's easy to expand into with their existing infrastructure, we felt India became a little more lucrative as an expansion destination than other markets like China, for example. So we had a lot of companies who were talking to who were looking at both India and China, and they're not sure about which one to go for. And because of the fact that in India, you can go with a product that's English first and launch it in India, we felt a lot of companies were talking to us and wanting to move to India first before they did to China. So we had many opportunities come up because of that. Like I said, because of the fact that there was generally a decrease in activity in venture capital, we also came across some organizations, some companies who were more interested in experimenting with the model that we have and testing out the waters in the Indian market. And there are a couple of success stories that have come out of that scenario as well. So as far as the investment model is concerned, I think that actually turned out to be an opportunity for us. And if anything, we have made more investments in the last 1 year than we have in the preceding 5 years of our international business model. And as a media company, I think, again, you'd be right in saying that, but probably one of the first things that companies cut down on when you have a crisis is marketing. But if they cut down on that, they probably cut down on the third or the fourth advertisers they have that they want to go with. The first and the second probably still remain because they still need the business from the consumer. And because of the fact that we have that massive presence in India, we are that trusted media partner. Thankfully, we didn't face the same as some of the other media companies did during this time.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And I think it's even, given that you have this specific model in which you work with companies, I think it's even better in moments like this when companies start to become a little bit more cash strapped, but they still need to reach those consumers, and having you as a
Exactly
long-term partner that can really bring them to market without an exorbitant marketing budget, I think is a great tool and resource right now in today's environment. I know we're getting close to the end of time here. I only had one last year question before we close out. I just wanted to spend the time really highlighting the unique aspects of what you've built as Brand Capital International. One, you guys produce a lot of different content. You have some really great ways in which you work with companies in building out a variety of different media campaigns. You do even more than that. You talk about events before you podcast. Maybe you want to share some of the unique aspects of what you guys done at Brand Capital International and how that helps your portfolio companies.
Most certainly. I think at Brand Capital International, our model is very bespoke in that we look at each company's individual need and try and figure out what will work best for them in the Indian market. So the idea is essentially to work with the company as if we are a part of their operating team and figure out what will work and will not work in India. In that, there's a lot of education, both on our part as a company's part, that goes in. We try and understand the space that they're trying to really address in the Indian market, develop a very strong, unique value proposition for the Indian market and how it needs to change from their home market. And in doing all of that, essentially, there's the strategic value that Brand Capital brings to the table. I think that's number one. I think point number two is, of course, like I said, being an outsourced CMO, being their marketing and communications team almost entirely, and taking that load off them really helps the company focus more on the product while we are addressing their how to reach the consumer need. And I think the third point is essentially finding who should they be working with in India to address the market and kind of, like I said, have that springboard into the Indian market rather than figuring their way around in India on their own. Right away, go to the people that who'd want to work with you and who you want to approach as your first potential target consumer or your first partner. So I think the network, the strategic value, with what we call value add internally, and the marketing piece is essentially what really sets us apart from other venture capital firms.
Awesome. Fantastic. Piyush, before I close out, was there anything else that you wanted to share, ask, or announce to the audience?
No, I'd like to again thank you, Kyle, for inviting me here. I think this is a great conversation, and I love what you guys are doing with the Media Top Startup Summit. Very excited to be a part of this and looking forward to many more such conversations. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for the audience. Why we had this conversation. We looked at a lot of different investors internationally that had a big focus on media, but also a consumer blend. And one of the companies that obviously stuck out to us was Brand Capital International and the Times Group overall. And the things that they've done is extremely impressive. Not only you're a venture fund that has built up the tools necessary to help companies expand into a market, but you've done it in a way where you built up a unique relationship with that company. You guide them through that process at how you mentioned at the end. I mean, India is a massive market, probably great for a lot of international companies to expand into, but also very complex and not an easy step to walk into. And being that perfect partner that can align not only your resources around it, but getting their products in front of the right customers, I think is a fantastic strategy. So Piyush, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle.